who will present on their, oh, um, who will, sorry, I got interrupted by a Zoom voice. Okay. Present on their recent archival exhibitions and reflect on what it means to work with intimate and collective histories on the political potential of making these archives public. So both of these exhibits were on view this past year. So they share a lot of commonalities, but they also are quite different in scale and scope. So we thought it would be really interesting to place them in conversation to get a sense of how to do kind of different types of exhibitions that make archival findings visible, public, available in different formats. So today we'll start with Liz Patton, who's an associate professor and chair of media and communication studies at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. Liz's current book project, documenting Black leisure as a form of resistance, examines the history of Black leisure and tourism in the U.S. through media of the Jim Crow era. She is the recipient of the 2023 National Endowment for the Humanities Fellowship and currently serves as, just completed her term as co-managing editor of Mediopolis, a journal of cities and culture. So she'll be talking about her exhibit related to her book project, Picturing Mobility, Black Tourism and Leisure During the Jim Crow Era. Take it away, Liz.
Oh, thank you. All right, I'm going to try to share my screen. Let's see, window. Oh, looks like it's working out for me. Can you see it?
Yes.
Okay. I have no idea what what you're looking at, so I will take your word for it. Do you see me now, or did it
Yeah,
flip?
you're to the side. It's in like slideshow view, so I can see the slides to the side and the main slide in the middle.
Okay. All right. Okay. Okay. All right. All right. So hopefully, okay, it's sharing a window. All right. So thank you, everyone. This is I want to keep it like workshoppy, but I do have to kind of give some context for it to, I think, to make sense in terms of what this project was all about. The I started out, honestly, the project started out accidentally. My grandmother had passed away, and my mom needed help. This was actually quite a few years ago. Wow, it's been 10 years, and so. I was trying to help my mother, like, basically deal with a bunch of archival stuff, and so in our house, and also just like furniture and things. And so I'm calling archival because there were tons of pictures, books, um, I think 16 millimeter film. It was just all over VHS stuff. So my mom just needed some help, and so I started looking through, and I found all these photographs, and which is where it kind of started. And I started asking her questions about where was this, what was happening. And then I was kind of embarrassed because I never really had these kind of conversations with her. And kind of what started the project is because of like all these pictures on the beach and in the park, and I didn't know, I didn't understand the history of it. And so my mom explained to me that when she was young, so this is her 1950s, she was, when she was a child, she was like, the beaches were segregated, and she grew up in Philadelphia. So I was honestly shocked and didn't know. I was like, oh, so and I was thinking like they were visiting family in the South, and she was like, no, they were segregated in New Jersey. And she said she didn't find out she was 12. So I started looking into various places. This image you see right here is a image from Addison Scurlock, and so which was he was a famous African American photographer during mostly during the Harlem Renaissance, but that he took of a summer camp at Highland Beach. And so I started looking in Maryland, and so I started looking in my local area, and then the project just kind of spread. So one of the things, so what I decided to do was I started thinking about the project in three ways. I started thinking about it as that I definitely obviously were planning to write a book, um, which I'm finishing up now. And then I was like, well, what other formats, could this work? And so originally, so there is a website that basically documents a lot of like different spaces across the country. And then I was approached by the director of special collections at my university, and I was asked, well, have you considered an exhibition? So I was like, fine. And so she was like, well, let's just apply for funding, NEA funding, some local Maryland state funding, and at the time I was also awarded a summer grant for NEH, and so I was like, well, you know what, I'm going to go for it. So by the time I applied for the full NEH fellowship, I was already pretty like planning all these three legs. And so a part of the fellowship was that I was going to have this project that would have an exhibition, a website, and a book. So here are some installation photos. It's a large space. There were over 230 individual objects, plus some video and oral histories, so audio playing on loop. Oh, I'm sorry, that we end up, it was going to be on loop, but then we ended up having to do it on demand because of acoustics and issues. And so video loop, but the audio was basically QR codes. And so we were able, set up. So it's a large space. This is just like a tiny fraction of it, but I just wanted to give you some sense. I'm going to try, let me see if I can stop sharing real quick. I just want to show you really quickly if this actually works. I'm going to show you just the other website. Let's see, Chrome tab. All right, here we go. So this is the website that was created for the exhibition, but this is not the website of my research, if that makes sense. So it was a lot of work. I had student interns working with me, and I'll talk about that really quickly in a few minutes. But pulling together this website, we work with a lot of different partners, which I'll talk about. And then it was just a matter of like organizing. So I'll just show you really quickly. Organizing around like what the topics were, where we got them from. I worked with students to help basically pull it together, right, in terms of and put it together. A grad student I worked with, and then also my research assistant, a student undergraduate research assistant, and then, like I said, I had 3 interns. Hold on, let me go jump back. All right, so we put together exhibition website early on to like kind of showcase it, and then it was the real work of like basically working with community partners to put it together. So some examples of community partners I work with were the Maryland State Archives, National Museum of African American History and Culture, and Highland Beach Association. But in terms of one of the biggest challenges, and it depends on like, if you're working within like just one archive or like a one institutional archive, it's a lot easier to pull stuff. But because I was pulling stuff from at least 20, or I should say loaning, is a better term, from at least 20 different archives, it became this big, like this game of like spreadsheets, and there was a lot of logistics that had to happen like I learned everything from like insurance to liability insurance to how you contact. I can tell you that, again, like for most institutions, I'll give you an example, like the Maryland State Archives or National Museum of African American History and Culture. You're talking about, you probably need to give them a year or 2 lead time to get loans, because if you think about, they're working within their own collection and what they want to put up in their own spaces, but then also other people are borrowing. But I did find a lot of benefits in terms of making connections, meeting new people, finding additional people to participate in oral histories. And then also, we have a program called CoLab, which is an interdisciplinary student internship program, and so I got to work with students in media studies, and geography, history, and public history. And I divide those because our public history program is very specific around museum studies, and the history were mostly students of African American history, but and in American studies. But the students had a key role in like basically helping with archival research, helping with mapping and the web development. I would not have been able to do any of this without, like, basically I had a computer science intern, I had a geography intern to help me with GIS, because we had a map where you could basically click on a location and you could see all the information about it and the images, and then also just helping me and also teaching them, which I found it was very rewarding in getting students interested in archival work, and like, what is it like to like go in and look at films or old home movies, or and they were really excited, students, to come with me to like the Smithsonian, or come with me to a church basement and like dig through stuff. And so it was really like I had them also engage with community archival partners. I had them write emails for me. I mean, obviously, like we talked about like how we create templates, how we send things out, but I found it quite rewarding, especially working with undergrads. We also conducted a lot of oral history interviews. Like I said, part of that was an exhibition, but part of that was also about the work. And so there was a lot of student involvement in preserving community voices. I wanted students to be involved, but I also wanted to, it took more, it was way more time. And I'm happy to answer questions about like doing oral histories than I expected in terms of scheduling and the logistics. But I did get quite a few. It didn't occur to me. It's not like you can say, oh, we'll just talk for 30 minutes. So you end up talking to somebody for like 2 hours. And so I learned many things, like again, the computer science student I worked with, who was very interested in photography and film as a minor. He was really helpful in helping me find ways to prepare and transcribe interviews, which if anybody here did it the old-fashioned way and just kind of listened to recording and typing it out, now programs like Otter AI can basically run everything through, even like this type of meeting. And it's pretty accurate, like 95%. I'm not the biggest fan of AI, but this is one of the areas where I was like, it actually does work. It's useful. I also, a lot of ethical issues came up that I think is important to bring up in this context. So when you're trying to think about thinking about public spaces and people's voices and their private archives, so it depends on what you're working with. But in my sense, these were mostly people's personal records, their memorabilia, their, in terms of like everything from like tickets to postcards to photos that something was written on the back. So I needed to consider, I wanted to consider like the larger historical social frameworks, because that's what I'm talking about, Jim Crow and racism and segregation in the US. But I realized a lot of this was a balance for respect for privacy. And the reason I really figured that out was my mother, there was a photo of her in a bikini on the beach. She was, I don't know, 16 or 17, and she didn't want anyone to see it. I love this photo, but she was just like, she asked that, she said I could use it locally, but not to publish it. And she didn't want it on a website. And so that kind of, like, working with family, let me start thinking about, or allowed me to start thinking about, what happens when I'm working with people that I don't know? And then also, how do I think about the privacy of images that I found on eBay? Like, I found lots of stuff on eBay, in other like public spaces, auctions. I met with in New York City with a lot of private collectors. I'm always surprised what people collect. And so, what does it mean? Like, you don't know who the people are in an image, and you have no way of tracking them down. So we had to make decisions of, like, if we're going to make certain images public, does this mean that like we have a cutoff? And so we decided that that if someone was likely alive, or the possibility of alive right now, like because they were children in a photo, that we wouldn't use it. And so we kind of like made those distinctions. And also the places that I went to, some of the places are still private spaces, they're not public spaces. There's some places are still contested, like in California. And so when I was like moving through these spaces, it was also a question of like what to showcase. In some cases, they didn't want that type of publicity because they want to kind of operate under the radar. And I could talk about that a little bit more, but it was interesting. So I tried to take a collaborative approach and just when interviewing people, and so and also trying to give back and not being like take as but also asking them what are some of the things they needed. And one of the things that people really appreciated was like me helping them digitize their home movies on 8mm or 16mm, like whatever that may be, or helping them digitize their images. So I introduced them to like the Maryland State Archives or the Smithsonian, and helping them with those projects. And then so this is I didn't advance the thought slide, but so it was always like balancing privacy and public interest. And so like an example was Ms. Williams. She wanted to donate to the Great Migration Home Movie Study Collection, and that's a big digitization project at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. But she was very clear with me that like if I came across any film of like her parents smoking, that she didn't want that to be released to the public, or so it was like it was constant negotiation, and also like me trying to like interview people to just give some context of like, well, why did you go here, or what did this space mean to you? So I was trying to avoid any risk of misrepresentation, and thinking about the important context in interpreting images, especially I think in terms of like personal images. So just really quickly summing up some behind the scenes. So some of the things I did learn early on that are really important is that you really do need to develop a curatorial narrative, which I did not know what that was. What that means is, are we thinking about this thematically? What does the room look like? Is it chronological, which was really kind of impossible for me to do. So we did it on obviously spaces, which is what I was interested in my own research. And so we organized spatially, but you can organize ours was actually organized spatially and thematically, the exhibition. And so a lot of the things it may seem like simple, but I found it very difficult to strategically select images and objects to display. So like what embodies like the argument, like what is the story that you're trying to tell as somebody walks through the space. Navigating rights, permission, copyrights, and loans. That was a whole other thing. I'm happy to answer any questions, but I like I said, I learned quite a lot. And then writing the interpretive text is where I spent a lot of time. Like everything from like how do you write a tombstone to how do you write an introduction, how do you put together the catalog for what images are representative, how do you summarize 200 and something images and into a narrative in a little like catalog book, and so all of these things that I've always taken for granted going to galleries or museums or whatever, I was like, oh, like this whole thing from picking paint colors for exhibition design. And so we went with a designer, the fabulous graphic designer, and it was just like questions like, well, how do you want it to feel? And I was like, well, I kind of wanted to feel like the Green Book, and I wanted to feel like 1960s and kind of like that aesthetic. And so we were like working towards that. And so like the earlier pictures that you saw, we used like a brown and greenish teal like color that was very popular for that period of time. And then the last thing was just learning how to develop public programming. We had 2 events, a curatorial talk that you may be asked to do, and then which is different than what your typical like research or paper talk. And again, I'll be happy to explain those differences if anybody has questions. And then we also had like events for people to come in. So it was all really it was very successful in that sense. We had over 5,000 unique viewers. We got press in the local, like Baltimore, the local papers, on the radio. I was very proud that for the main arts publication for Maryland and in DC area, we was listed as like exhibitions to see the weekend. So I thought that was really cool. So it was a rewarding experience, but I guess I just want to, my takeaway is just, it's real. If the scale is really large, which it was, you do have to work with partners. And so that's why I say we, because I don't see it like, even though I was the curator, there's a whole team of people that helped me pull it together, from PR to, you know what I mean, to graduate assistants, to people who just place things on walls and tell me, do I like where it's centered? So, do you know what I mean? Like, in terms of like that type of work. All right. Sorry. Thank you.
Excellent. Thanks, Liz. Yeah, as I mentioned, different scope and scale. We're going from the big scale to the smaller scale with the project that I worked on with Erica. But I think even on the small scale, you learn that it's a lot of work and you have to work with a lot of people and a lot of partners. So that translates. All right. So Erica Stein is chair and associate professor of film at Vassar College. Her research focuses on the spatial politics of popular and alternative cinemas. She is the author of Seeing Symphonically, Avant-Garde Film, Urban Planning, and the Utopian Image of New York, co-editor of the Rutledge Companion to Media in the City, and co-founder of Mediopolis, a journal of cities and cultures. She is currently working on a book project about property and crime in film and television, and if I may add, also a book proposal with Noel Griffiths on women's work, which is the subject of this talk and exhibit as well. It was called Women's Work: Organizing New York Independent Film and Video.
Okay. Hi, everybody. So I'll share my slides as well. And since I have the benefit of going second and knew that I would, um, I'm going to talk a little bit less about some of the background of the show, although I will talk about that. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about, I guess what I would say is uses of sort of, or what exhibition can do around archival materials as well as around certain kinds of projects, and some of like the practical issues of design and content and communication, as well as sort of like what can come out of those projects. And I'm going to briefly tell you what you're looking at, and then I'll jump right in. But so um, you're looking at a photograph taken by Bev Grant, who is an early member of Newsreel, the New York chapter, who was also a folk singer, an activist, a photographer, and a number of other things. And this is a photograph that she took of an organizing session of New York radical women as they were planning to protest the 1968 Miss America pageant in Atlantic City. And then she and one of her collaborators, Karen Liptak, made a film called Up Against the Wall, Miss America, which entered into the Newsreel catalog and then became really the beginning of Newsreel's at least attempting to engage with women's issues, the feminist movement, and attracting more women to the group. So this was also the signature image of our show, Women's Work: Organizing Independent New York Film and Video. And while, as Noelle mentioned, we're also working on a book about this topic, and I'll say a little bit more about what that topic is because I realized I skipped that part. This exhibit was actually conceptualized not so much to support the book, but as to support another project that's in connection with it. So really briefly, our project is about foregrounding and mapping the organizational labor that was required to sort of imagine, coalesce, and sustain independent media collectives, whether experimental film, activist video, community television broadcast in New York from the mid-1960s to the mid-1990s. And the term comes out of this idea of the kind of work that is traditionally associated with women's role in basically invisibly supporting patriarchal and capitalist structures. So clerical work, caretaking work, domestic labor, the work of connectivity, et cetera. And we were really interested in what happens when you think about that kind of labor in the context of progressive and sometimes feminist media projects, because all that work still needs to happen for independent media to exist. And there are a number of origin points for the project, but one was actually Noelle's experience with a number of key figures in New York collectives, and they're actually on the next page. So from left to right, this is Dee Dee Halleck, who's co-founder of Paper Tiger Television, Deep Dish TV Network, very involved in Manhattan News Network, as well as a number of other of activist television public access groups. The center is Ariel Doherty, who's co-founder of Women Make Movies. And on the right in profile is Sandra Schulberg, who's the president of Indie Collect. They also all have long history in arts education, intertwined with the Young Filmmakers Foundation in New York. And at dinner following the memorial service for Roger Larson, who was founder of Young Filmmakers Foundation, Noelle ended up at dinner with all of these ladies, as well as Amelie Rothschild, who was not here because she was in Italy, which is a better place to be than Poughkeepsie in February, I will tell you that. And during this experience, Ariel mentioned that she and a number of the other women at that table and in their circle ended up making, many fewer films and videos than the men that they worked with because they were spending so much of their time organizing. And we were really interested in telling a history of independent media that is centered on that organization. And the photograph that you're looking at is taken from a symposium that we convened on that topic in Poughkeepsie this February. And so we had panels made up of folks who basically came from similar areas and backgrounds. We had one on activist media, which featured Bev, as well as JT Takagi is the current head of Third World Newsreel, featured Cyril Phipps, who is a co-founder of Black Planet Productions, as well as other folks from that world. We also had a program on curation and programming, et cetera, et cetera. And our closing event was actually held by Juana Suarez, who's the current director of MIAP at NYU. And it was specifically about how to handle preserving your personal collections and archives, which was really interesting to us because we thought that all of these women who are like media professionals would sort of maybe not need this. And then it turned out that a lot of people really did, including people who already have a number of professional collections housed at places like NYU's Fales Library, but who still have personal collections like in their closets at home. So as we were convening this symposium, one thing that became very apparent very quickly was that we were running a symposium about independent film, video, and television without any screenings. And that was in large part because of two reasons. First, we didn't have time. And second, because we didn't have time to show something by all 23 panelists, and we didn't want people to be really angry at us, to be completely honest. And so I was like, we should do an exhibition at the campus museum because that will be much easier, because Liz had not yet given her presentation explaining why that would in fact not be easy. So I'm just going to talk for a few more minutes, but I want to go over how can archival exhibition intersect and support other non-manuscript-based scholarly pursuits? In this case, it really was about supporting the symposium, although there were other outputs of it. How can we use archives and the exhibition, or the use of archives in an exhibition, to concretize like a kind of more abstract and not necessarily representational-based set of ideas? And how can we do that through both the content and the design of an exhibit? What are sort of connections and new directions that can emerge from an archive or multiple archives when they're recontextualized in an exhibit? And how can you, or at least how did we include film, video, and televisual content in an exhibit without it sort of overwhelming or taking over the entire space or the entire nature of the exhibit and kind of overriding what we wanted to do? And I do have a little what we wish we'd known, but it's slightly more, I think, specific than Liz, since we've benefited from Liz going over that already. So let me just screen share again. Um, and I wanted to show you actually our sort of wall text and slide. And so, okay. So as we were thinking about how to use this exhibit to basically support the symposium, we were kind of thinking about it in two ways. First, as we're thinking about, this pretty long span of historical time and a lot of different organizations, we wanted that to be legible to people who are not part of that world. And the symposium actually turned out to be pretty well attended by a number of local people, students, people coming from out of town. And because the panels were done in the styles of oral history, there's often not going to be a lot of contextualizing information offered in those conversations. So we thought of the exhibit as a way of framing the symposium to a certain extent and making it more legible to people who were not participants and who might not have been part of that world. And that legibility also included things like, what does this kind of labor look like? What are its artifacts? What are its outputs? Like, where does this go? And then also, how do we capture the sensibility and tension that we're trying to evoke between this term like women's work and like the kind of work that people are doing? And we were thinking about that with a lot of help from actually our co-curators, who are two colleagues of mine who are not on this call right now, as well as the team at the Vassar Campus Art Museum, about thinking about like, how do we communicate that in the design of the exhibit as well as in the actual contents of the exhibit. So if you look at the wall text, and much like Liz, I was like, why am I picking out paint colors? Like, I am both under and overqualified for this job. Like, what is happening? I've never had a conversation about what font looks more punk before. And I did have a moment where I'm like, Comic Sans, like, what are we doing? But so one thing that we ended up doing was actually picking up on the color scheme and the zine-like aspects of one of the key organizations that we sort of drew from, which is Paper Tiger Television and Deep Dish TV, which is its sister organization. And so every object in this case comes from Paper Tiger or Deep Dish. I'm not going to go into details about what you're looking at. I can talk more about it later if you'd like me to. But all of our everything from Paper Tiger and Deep Dish actually came from Dee Dee. So Noelle and I drove up to her house in Willow in New York, and she was just like, "Do you want a bumper sticker from Deep Dish TV?" And we were like, "Yes, we do." And then the one thing I will mention is that in the top right corner, that's a reproduced panoramic photograph of a combined Paper Tiger Deep Dish planning meeting to protest the first Gulf War in 1991 and to plan programming around it. So we pulled from the Paper Tiger aesthetic, which you can really see right here in this 1992 flyer from their Dreamhouse exhibition. And we incorporated that into the actual design of the show. So these are actual decals and blow-ups taken from one of their pamphlets, which was the Paper Television Guide to TV Repair, which we also featured in the exhibit. And we included it in the text of sort of the wall exhibit to make it really legible. And then we kind of tried to go with this throughout, where we focused on thinking about, I'll come back to this in a sec, but how to make the space look more like a workshop or more like a work in progress to kind of get at the sense of like organizing labor and ongoing efforts. I should also mention we were in a much, much smaller space than Liz. I feel a little bit like a New York real estate agent, and that I'm trying to avoid showing you exactly how small the room is. But because the vitrine in the center is visible in both shots, you can probably guess how small the room is. So we were really trying to figure out, how do we maximize this space and keep the story that we're telling clear, while also sort of getting as much in front of the visitors as we can. And so one thing that we did was we really emphasized hands-on relationships between visitors and the materials. So it was interesting to hear Liz talk about like the lead time that she had with archives and the discussion that she had with archives. Almost everything that we got came from basically they were lent by artists or by the organizations themselves. And that really cut down on a lot of our time. The exception is actually on this wall. I couldn't quite get a better photograph, so I'm sorry about that. But these are objects related to the Sojourner Truth Festival of the Arts from 1976. and particularly the film program, which was run by Monica J. Freeman, who was one of our panelists. And it's understood to be the first arts festival focused on the creativity of Black women in the US. And so we had this photograph of the 5 organizers of the festival, as well as, which we knew existed because it was in a journal article published by our colleague Haley O'Malley. And then we had the actual program, the film program from the festival and the flyer. And we were able to basically work with the University of Maryland to get, sorry about that, to get facsimile of the schedule and the flyer. And then we worked with Michelle Wallace, who's one of the organizers of that festival and is the daughter of Faith Ringgold, the artist who took this photograph, to try to figure out how to get a good copy, although her mom's archive is, I think, in a little bit of a mess, and so is hers. And so we ended up just working with a high quality digital scan. But the reason I wanted to point this out is because you'll see that on the wall, just about everything is unframed, and is put up in sort of this raw kind of way, which goes toward that aesthetic and that sense of process we were working toward. And this is also basically a reading corner where we made facsimile of a number of objects from Women's Studio Workshop, which I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute. These posters are also from them, as well as catalog donated by Sarah, who's the former head of the Filmmakers Co-op, artist book by Lynn Sachs and Peggy Awish, and a number of objects actually on the iPad itself that relate to different projects that a number of our members did. And so guests are basically invited to sit at this table and actually pick up and go through the facsimile of all these objects to really get at, like, what do programming notes look like? What do budgets for these organizations look like? What does it mean to put this together? What names do you see reappearing over and over and in different combinations? And one thing that that meant for us is that we were able to understand these kind of new directions and connections by working with the archives. So first of all, those are Noelle's fingers in the middle shot, with a really good manicure. And this is taken from when we actually went to the Women's Studio Workshop archives in Kingston, New York. So Ariel, as well as a number of other luminaries of the downtown New York film scene, ended up actually living and working upstate for quite a while. A lot of that was actually economically driven. And one thing we're interested in is how is the period and concepts that we're talking about actually tied to the urban crisis in certain ways, because it makes it possible for these organizations to have these huge downtown spaces to operate in. And then you can see people start to get pushed out. And so Ariel had a long-running series at Women's Studio Workshop called Women's Work in Film, fortuitously enough. And so we went to their studio and we found not only a number of posters from this series that they were exhibiting, but in their archive, the programming and the history of that series, as well as related events. So if you can see on this side, this is Women's Studio Workshop is an arts collective. They do a lot of printmaking, graphic design, risograph, and other hands-on materials. And this is a handmade flyer for Carolee Schneeman's 1983 performance, which was held in Kingston. Unfortunately, I don't have the back of this, but it turned out that it was designed by Patricia Spears Jones, who's also one of the 5 coordinators of the Sojourner Truth Festivals of the Arts, which we had not known that she was involved in. And as we worked through the Women's Studio Archive holdings, we also found things like, I wish I had a better shot of this, sorry about that. Nancy Kane, who is a founding member of the Video Freaks Collective, was working with the Women's Studio Workshop to do specifically pirate TV, public access cable in the Catskills and in upstate New York at this time, and was actually giving presentations and discussions at Women's Studio Workshop. So this opened new directions for us in terms of thinking about this as a New York project, but to a certain extent as a regional project, as well as thinking about what are some of these lesser known organizations and connections that also play a role. Last but not least, I want to just talk about like what it meant to have film, video, and broadcast content in the exhibition and also in a space this small. So as you can see, we used cathode ray tube TVs for our media content, unlike Liz's sort of like look like handhelds maybe. And okay, first, I will say I have a meeting with the museum's curatorial team next week to discuss whether or not we're sending a lawyer letter to the manufacturer of these televisions. So I will just not go into that, but I will just mention that it was a total nightmare. And if you happen to have any kind of Trinitron, Sony product, or other cathode ray tube TV, don't throw it out because it can actually be very useful for exhibition and other reasons as well. But essentially, the reason we ended up doing this is because the Vassar Art Museum is a very aesthetically conservative institution in a lot of ways, and they did not have a mechanism for showing time-based media of any kind. And so we need to figure out how to do that, how to do it in a small space, and how to do it in such a way that it supported the exhibit and our curatorial focus without taking over. And once again, sort of the products themselves, the directors themselves, sort of artist statement themselves, overriding what we wanted to say about organizational and particularly invisible labor that it takes to make this stuff. And so part of the reason we went with CRTs is because it fit our aesthetic and it called back to this earlier time. It also takes up physical space in the room in a particular way. And it's also just worth noting a lot of our content was analog video to begin with. And walking into this space and seeing a lot of these clips on analog video screens when we'd only ever seen them, on laptops before, was really a revelation where it's like, oh, that's the color that's supposed to be. Like, that's the depth of field that this is supposed to have. Yeah, I see that I'm out of time. So that's basically just what I'm going to stop with. And thank you guys for your patience. And I'm going to leave it there.
All right. Excellent. Thanks so much. I'll start with kind of an opening question, and then if anybody wants to jump in with furthers. So I'm just kind of thinking about, in our own process and Liz's, in all of these different iterations, we're looking at taking research and trying to make it visible in different forms. Some are short term, a symposium and an exhibit. Some are we're looking for long-term ways, the book projects, online resources, things like that. But we're always kind of, because it's so interpersonal, we're always thinking about two audiences. Um, First audience being the one that is interested but doesn't know this history and would be interested to know. But this interpersonal aspect kind of makes the audience we're always kind of aware that the people who were involved or tangentially involved in these histories are watching, are looking at it, are kind of, we had, Bev Grant, when she came into the exhibit, everybody's excited to see like their own histories and pointing out more aspects of it. But she's also like, oh, you have that year wrong. And I was like, actually, I have it right because this and this and this. And she's like, oh, okay. Like, so there's like a double kind of like fact checking, but also like an obligation, kind of this like the reciprocity aspect and this obligation to do their history right in ways that's very different than like going into the files and doing histories of big Hollywood people who you don't have to think about their feelings when you're writing or you're putting things on display. So Liz, you kind of touched on this with like just thinking about the photo of your mom and other people, but I was wondering if you just wanted to both kind of speak to how that interpersonal aspect kind of changes both the display, like the literal display in an exhibit, and sort of how you want to narrativize and tell this history.
That's like, there you go. I found it stressful. Like my mom was like, I can deal with my mother, but but to your point about, I laughed when you said about the date. So I had similar, um, so just to give you a sense of like, there must have been like 10 walls and then like many different like floor space and then like a portal, like I don't know what to call it, um like a movable wall that was double sized. So there was a lot there, and so it was a mix of, I didn't clarify, there were at least 4 families that were showcased, and then most of the rest of it was like institutional. And the families what really made me nervous because of course they brought everyone right to the opening, and they hadn't like they weren't involved in like the actual installation. And so even though they greenlight, like, in terms of like what was going to be up or not, but it was, I was like trying to make sure like the dates are correct and like the like, little tombstone labels, and so there was a couple of times where like I was confronted by two family members who were just like, "That's wrong. That wasn't a place. That's not." Like, you know what I mean? And I'm like, that's what your family told me. But I mean, but the point is that I was nervous because there is something strange, about it. And I was also nervous about, just going back to our theme about place, is that there were photos where we were not 100% sure of like the date or the actual, even if this was like we were 90% sure from landmarks that this was that particular place, but different from a different point of view, if that makes sense what I'm trying to say. And so we're like in the like description, like maybe such and such beach, or do you know what I mean? And so so there was always this tension where I was worried about either a journalist or a family member, someone saying like, you did not represent, do you know what I mean? Like, this is incorrect. And it gave me a lot of anxiety. I got past it. We decided to put in the catalog really quickly. Like, there was some language of like, this is interpretation and we can mess up. Oops. Like, you know what I mean? Like, I purposely put that in there. So to like, I mean, to give myself cover and say that, we're humans and students and people worked on it.
I think, it's interesting because a lot of, I think, our conversation around managing essentially like donors and participants' expectations actually also had to do with a sense of like shared or contested history. So like, how are we placing the newsreel photographs in connection to third world news photographs? How are we telling that story? How many photographs does each person get, right? And like, where are we putting things? And because we were getting all of these things directly from these artists and organizations, not all of whom were very easy to work with and none of whom had terms, but there was definitely that pressure that Liz is talking about, not so much for us in terms of like, where is this, when was this, but more in terms of like, how much space does Abby get and how much space does Peggy get, and who's more likely to be really mad at us if she's unhappy with that, which is
And we
like
know the
not.
answer.
Oh yeah, it's Abby is definitely the answer. But
Keep that in the room.
anybody who's met either of them knows that that's the answer to the question. But which is not the decision making that you want to make, right? But I mean, and this may have factored into Liz's decision making too, but there's also the sense of like, well, we want to do oral histories with these people and we want them to be supportive of the project. And a lot of the ways that we're generating this network that we're kind of mapping is through interpersonal connections. And of course, you're there to celebrate people who have often felt marginalized in the histories that they help make, and you don't want to contribute to that. So that was definitely something we were working through.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Erica. That I think that's probably what what kept me up a little bit is that I didn't want to add to any type of marginalization, because even though, as a woman, as a Black woman, like, you know what I mean, like, it's just like you're like, I think you're as a woman, you're dealing with other, but you don't want to contribute to it, like, you know what I mean, like this, like I didn't want to be a part of that longer history, and so it was like that's what kept me up.
Yeah. Even when we talked to some folks at Media Burn about this too, like anytime you put on an event like that's celebrating a certain history, people feel left out and it suddenly becomes, it's not an event that has some of it, but like people start seeing it as the event. So if they feel left out or marginalized in it was an emotional, like kind of interpersonal journey. So it's really different. It's really much more rewarding. It's like we saw people go into the exhibit and like see their stuff and be excited and talk about it. But also like super, super nerve-wracking. So it's time for a couple more questions from other folks. Sophia?
Thank you both for this presentation. This was really interesting and great. Erica, you talked a little bit about this during your presentation and just now when you said something about how you were telling these stories, but I'd be curious to hear from both of you a bit more about what sorts of recontextualization or narration work you did, and even like what did those conversations look like as you take these materials from the archive and put them, in like to these public exhibition spaces.
Oh, I didn't turn off my mic fast enough. I guess that means I have to go first. So I genuinely would be really interested to hear what Liz has to say about this because it sounds like she had a lot more preparation for her exhibit and had, frankly, maybe put a lot more thought into it than we did at the outset. And so, there's the mechanical answer, which is that you're doing a lot of text that's also doing that. The placement is doing that. Some of that also has to do with what the objects are. So we had a bunch of optical prints with the soundtrack revealed. They're work process prints from from an experimental film that's also like a feminist work, and putting that on the wall as though it were basically like a piece of art is doing, I think, hopefully really potent recontextualization, which is like, this is the process. Like, we're inviting you to see the process and we're inviting you to appreciate and understand it. We were also doing things like treating, you know, a particular work not necessarily about its director or what it stood for, but how it fit into the larger story we were telling. So, like, there's a film called Heretics, which is about the feminist magazine Heresies, that we included both because the poster is really cool and it replaces a hammer and sickle with traditional like feminist or women-based and like art objects instead, but also because it turned out that a number of our subjects had worked for that magazine doing paste up or other sort of like behind the scenes labor. And so that was like a way of guiding people out of the exhibit. But I think the recontextualization was a lot about what the exhibit was in and of itself. It was often, here's ephemera, and we want you to treat it like something else.
I'll just chime in one other thing too, is we want to, in our broader project, is like see a lot of these organizations in relation to one another that had formerly been seen as separate. So we thought about that and what our screens were. They were still like kind of had themes, but we wanted people to see connections between all these organizations. Like it's not just like there was an avant-garde world and then there was a community media world and there was an activist world. All these things were like deeply interpersonally and interspatially related.
Yeah, I would say so. I agree with Erica. A lot of it is because I didn't realize how much text you have to writing you have to produce. So a lot of it was just like writing for, like, you know what I mean, the introduction, what's going to go up, the catalog. But I did have a lot of time to think about it as a project, and so the question that I like everyone that helped me from the the dean of the gallery to like all the people were involved, they kept asking me the same question, like, what is the visual story that you are trying to tell, right? So they're like, even though there is text for context, I guess the principle, and I was working with someone with background in museum studies, is that someone needs to be able to navigate the space and like understand it, right? So it's like and like it has to be legible, which Erica talked about earlier, in terms of what you're trying to convey without like depending on the text, right? And so that was I actually enjoyed that challenge, but I found it challenging. And so, but once we thought about like how it's organized, but what is like it helped like writing out the curatorial talk ahead of time, and then like working, because once I realized, okay, what is like the narrative that I'm trying to, like, what am I trying to say about this? Like I heard Erica, you said like this workshop, this space, right? Like you're trying to, like, I think it kind of comes together like in that sense. And so my like we were trying to play with the word picturing mobility, right? So like picturing in terms of like film and photos, and then mobility in terms of like upward mobility, like socioeconomic mobility, but actual physical mobility. So we're playing with those terms. And so because that was like the organizing principle, and the other idea was, what does it mean for African Americans to document their own leisure history, right? So it helped me think through, because, you know, I just had to always make sure that I went back to the organizing narrative and like, what was that? It's like when you're writing a book, what is that like thesis, or like, do you know what I mean? What is that argument that you're in, like keep holding on to that? Because otherwise you will, I don't know what Erica and Noelle, if you agree, but you can go on many different tangents, like, you know, even an exhibition. I thought it was easy too. And then it was like a really rude awakening.
Excellent. Yeah, and because we were working with artists, they were like, "Why don't you put this in it?" And we're like, and then we were glad to have like other like curators and you know, people working with us who were like, we don't really see how that fit. And so we have to make the argument, and if you can't make the argument, then it's not gonna go. Yeah. We are at one. I don't know if anybody wants to ask a final question though from the rest of our audience.
I had a quick question, just kind of on that note. I wouldn't say I have a ton of experience working in the archive, but I have dabbled in the archive and I love the archive. And I want to do more archival research. So I found both of your projects really inspiring in terms of what archival research can look like, where it could go, kind of. And my biggest challenge always is like just getting overwhelmed by the wealth of material in the archive. And I wonder how both of you kind of dealt with that, with making selections just in the research stage of like what to actually look at, because you can't look at all of it. And then also because you both worked with films, I'm curious, I've encountered a lot of challenges with like seeing records where there I know I can see that there's boxes that contain like 16 mm film, but there's no way to actually view them. And so how you kind of dealt with working with film material as well. So two questions, but
Do you want, Erica, do you want yeah, whew, the film one and the slides are the little projection slides or stills are like my biggest headache. Anyway, so yes. So it's been a really interesting experience because one, you're right, you can't look at everything, right? So what I ended up like, I'm unfortunately, like, you're making decisions like even going into an archive. And so and then like you said, you're fairly new at it. What you'll find is, for in most cases, like if institutional formal archives, they're going to say like, well, you have like 5 hours and you can only take out 10 boxes, or I don't know, 5 boxes, or whatever it may be, right? Like out 10 was actually really generous, but you know what I mean, like 1 box per hour, so, or something like that. So and so you kind of like, I've learned to really, 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 really read finding aids and really like figure out. And so I do a lot of prep before I even show up. Like, do you know what I mean? In terms of like, what am I looking for? But then trying to leave some space for like those surprises, which most people love about the archive. But yes, I have come across so many times where in institutions you would think it wouldn't happen. Like, for instance, I was at Duke and in Yale, they were just like, they're like, here's some boxes. We haven't even looked through this. Like, you know, someone donated. And so it's kind of cool to be the first person to really like look at something beyond like when you know, they initially acquired something. But it is a process. So my advice would be is to really have like some sort of organizational system. I have a huge database where I have, I'm not kidding, probably now 20,000 images and links to like I take, sometimes I'll take a screenshot or a film still, like, you know what I mean? Like in terms of, so I just kind of remember, I have a whole note system. It's going to sound silly, but I don't know, like sometimes I like it's just kind of like the image that kind of like, like how they say like punk them, or like, you know what I mean, like something that's just kind of like that's sometimes how I pick, or like it's around the theme, but it's a lot of managing. I don't know if Erica and Noel, you agree. Like I think it's like you need to know what you have, but you can't remember everything, so you have to have a system of like what's there, because I have to revisit sometimes, right? Or I would say really quickly, invest in the relationships with people that work in these spaces, whether it be like I said, I've worked with families to collectors, private collectors, to large institutions like the Smithsonian. I at every turn it's like, this is like Erica's point, is all relational, because also I wanted to do oral histories, but my point is that because I found that I had to go back and say, oh, I heard you have this, or I missed this, or is this box 27 and I can't fly over. Do you mind opening this, looking at this box for me? And I've 90% of the time, they will do it if they feel like, you know what I mean? So I spend a lot of time like building a relationship while it was actually in the archive. And so I can have continued access, because I found it's not a one and done, that you know what I mean? Like you're going and then really, 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 really understand those finding aids. Some are better than others. But to like, for that level. And then for families, it's like usually, or like I would say artists, or like I've worked with like individuals or even private collectors, they don't really have finding aids, or they don't obviously, but coming up with some system to figure out what's there, right? Because I've had people open up a room and say, well, this is where I put all our family stuff. And I'm like, oh my God. Like, you know what I mean? Like that type of thing. So I'm still learning.
It was interesting. Like I would say in every other archival use that I've ever engaged in, sounds weird, but like any other time I've had to use the archives, it's basically been exactly what Liz described and exactly what you described, Emmett. This was a very different, for me, approach to the archive. And I think it had to do with where we were in the project and what kind of project it was. So like, first of all, my overall advice would be when you go to an archive, you need to know where you are in your project, right? You need to be open to the idea that what you find there may like change where you are in your project, because everybody loves a surprise, hates a surprise. But I think you need to basically know like, why are you going there before you go? Not just in terms of the topic, but in terms of your own project. For us with this project, it was a very, very different experience, because it was stuff that in a way had almost all been previously curated, right? So like we basically went to a women's studio workshop. Like we knew that when this series that Ariel had run, we knew when it began, we knew when it ended, so we knew what boxes we needed. And we were like there's a lot of stuff in there that was super cool, but it wasn't really hard to basically figure out, this is useful for us for this specific purpose, and this is not. And that's very different than every other experience I've ever had in the archive. I mean, that was true even in personal collections like with Dee Dee Halleck or MM Sarah, where a lot of it is like coming out of their house. I don't know whether curated is the exact way I would describe what they've done with their stuff, but like they do know where everything is. And in the course of the conversation, one thing can lead to another, and it's like, oh, actually, I wouldn't have thought that you had X, but like, sure, I want to see this protest flyer that you made for when PBS was just showing BBC stuff instead of like local stuff, and what that looked like. So it was, I think it threw into relief what archival work is usually like, because it was so different, and to be honest, so much easier, because we already had so many parameters that you don't usually have when you're doing that kind of work.
Can I add something real quick, Emma? Because I thought about, because I didn't answer, well, like your question about like when you come across like things that you're like, oh, I can't actually watch them. So I've there have been times where I was like a no ability, but I've also with families and in collectors, they've allowed me to like take home, and you know what I mean. And so I shouldn't say well, take with me. And so I have equipment here, right, in my office, not, my department, where I can like try to, we have some, legacy stuff where we could actually view some of this stuff. I just, be careful not to like, like to damage it. That was my nervousness. But a lot of times it was a matter of like, oh, they were like, we didn't know this was in the box. And they were like, well, we can try to digitize, but then that took like months. You know what I mean? Like, so there are things where I'm just kind of looking and trying to see, like, can you imagine, like, you know what I mean? I'm looking at the film strip and I'm like, I think this is about, like, do you know what I mean? But like, and I'm looking at a, what do you call it when you put your on the light board? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, I was literally looking at stuff with a little, like, a little viewer to try to figure out what it was, and so I could at least describe it. But it, unfortunately, with this type of work, is going to happen.
Yeah. We had pre-selected our films pretty much, just kind of what we knew and what we wanted to put together, and what we had seen. But it was a little, because we just did excerpts of most of them. So it was a lot of tracking them down, finding if it was better to get them directly, if the filmmaker had a digitized excerpt they could send, or if we had to go to the archives. And Erica ran down to Tribeca to get an excerpt one day. I ran down to Lower East Side to get some images. Like a lot of kind of running around. So it was a little less traditional, but we did work with some of the film archives that are kind of, that was actually the easiest part because they're really well set up for doing that. And most of them, because they're nonprofit, took very, very small kind of stipend to do that work. So that was good. Yeah. All right. Well, we're 10 minutes over. Any other final comments, questions, thoughts? It looks good. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming.
And I was gonna say, if
you.
anybody wants to email me, or like, I could put my email in the chat. Not saying I'm an expert, but but I have learned. Oops, what in the world? I did. The process was, I don't know why it's trying to overwrite when I'm trying to type. There it is. I'm willing to, I just kind of, what I've learned. It's a whole process. But thank you.
Yeah, it's a learning process. I wish we had talked to some of the people who've done it before.
Right.
One thing I'd say is it's more work than you imagine.
Yeah.
Very rewarding work, but it's there's so many things you would not think about.
There's a lot of spreadsheets.
A lot of spreadsheets.
Many spreadsheets.
Yes. I mean, the spreadsheets are, yeah. And down to like the dimensions of things and what it's made out of and stuff like that. I'm like, oh my. So anyway.
Yeah. Awesome. Excellent. Thank you so much.
Thank you for planning.
Thanks EPEC for thinking of this one. And
thank you.
thanks, Sophia,
so
for
much,
organizing our invites. And Emma, we'll talk to you soon about next steps. Excellent.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks, Mary, and YG for coming.